I always thought my father, Daniel Hayes, was the kind of man who carried no secrets. He had that quiet, steady presence, the kind that filled a room without saying much. After his funeral, people spoke about him like he was carved from the very idea of decency. A man of integrity, a man of principle, a man who never raised his voice but always made himself heard. I wanted to believe that image. Maybe I needed to. It was the only version of him that made sense to me. But then, a week after we buried him, I opened the drawer in his old writing desk, the one he always kept locked, and everything I believed about him began to unravel. Inside, beneath stacks of yellowed receipts and faded photographs, was a black leather notebook. No title, no name, just a thin red ribbon marking a page somewhere in the middle. My father had been meticulous, even obsessive about order, but the notebook looked worn, as if it had been opened hundreds of times. I remember sitting there in the dim light of his study, the scent of cedar and old paper thick in the air, staring at that notebook for what felt like hours. When I finally opened it, I wasn't prepared for the first line. If Emily ever finds this, I hope she forgives me before she understands. My name. My father's handwriting. My chest tightened as if the air itself had turned to glass. The entries weren't dated, but the first few pages read like confessions. He wrote about arguments I vaguely remembered, tense dinners, whispered calls behind closed doors, the night my mother left for her sisters and didn't come back for 2 weeks. But the way he described them wasn't how I remembered. In his words, my mother wasn't cold or distant. She was cornered. I thought I was protecting her, he wrote. But what I was really protecting was my pride. I closed the notebook after that, my hands trembling. I didn't want to keep reading. But curiosity, or maybe fear, pushed me forward. I turned another page. That's when I found a name I didn't recognize, Eleanor. He mentioned her several times. Eleanor warned me this would happen. Eleanor said truth has a cost. Eleanor was right. Emily will hate me if she ever learns. My mind raced. I didn't know any Eleanor connected to my father. She wasn't a family friend, not a relative. Who was she? I spent the next few days pretending to be fine, cleaning out closets, sorting through boxes, smiling when the neighbors brought casseroles. But every night I went back to that desk, reading another few pages, uncovering a version of my father I'd never met. He wrote about a fight over the family house, about choosing sides between his brother Michael and his mother. He wrote that he'd done something unforgivable, something that cut the family in two. I remembered those years vaguely. I was maybe 10 when Dad stopped visiting his brother. They never spoke again after Grandma died. Mom always told me it was over a misunderstanding. But in his notebook, Dad confessed that the misunderstanding was his doing. I lied to protect what I thought was ours, he wrote. But what I took wasn't money. It was trust. Reading those words, I felt something twist inside me. This man I'd idolized had deliberately hurt his own brother. And for what? The details were still murky, but the guilt that soaked through every page made it clear it wasn't small. I tried to sleep that night, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying that first line. If Emily ever finds this, did he know I would? Did he leave it there on purpose? A few days later, I drove to my Uncle Michael's house, the first time in years. His home sat at the edge of a quiet Massachusetts town, surrounded by tall oaks and silence. When he opened the door, he looked older than I remembered, tired, but not surprised to see me. "Emily," he said quietly, "you look just like him." I didn't know what to say to that. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. I didn't even know if he'd attended. The church had been too full, too heavy with condolences. I told him I'd found something that might matter to both of us. He hesitated before letting me in. His living room smelled faintly of coffee and dust. On the mantel, a photo of 2 young men stood between 2 candles, my father and him, smiling, arms over each other's shoulders. "He wrote about you," I said, pulling the notebook from my bag. His eyes darkened instantly. "He told me once he burned it," Michael said. "Guess he changed his mind." I froze. "You knew about it?" "Oh, I knew," he said bitterly. "That's the thing about Daniel. He couldn't live with his lies, but he couldn't face the truth either." I opened the notebook and handed it to him. He turned a few pages, reading silently. When he reached a certain line, his expression cracked, anger and grief mixing into something I couldn't read. "He told you, didn't he?" I asked. "Told me what?" Michael snapped. "That he forged our mother's will. That he made sure the house went to him, not to me." I couldn't breathe. The words hit like cold water. That can't be true. He looked at me, eyes glistening. You think I'm lying? He wrote it down. Emily, read it yourself. My hands trembled as I took the notebook back. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew he was right. I drove home in silence, the notebook resting on the passenger seat like a living thing, heavy with breath I didn't want to hear. The road blurred through the tears I didn't let fall, and every sound, the hum of tires, the rhythmic thump of my heartbeat, felt like someone whispering his name. When I finally parked in front of the house, I didn't go inside right away. I sat there in the dark, staring at the faint reflection of my father's face in the glass, the one memory that refused to fade. Him fixing the old fence when I was 8, wiping sweat off his brow, smiling when he caught me watching. That image had always been my anchor. Now it was rusting away in front of me. I went inside and opened the notebook again, desperate for something. An explanation, a justification, anything that could soften what I'd just learned. The next few entries were shorter, scattered thoughts written in uneven lines. I never meant to hurt him. I told myself I was protecting the family, but I think I was just protecting the illusion of being right. Eleanor said the truth doesn't erase love. I hope she's right. Eleanor again. The name scratched against my mind like static. Who was she to him? His conscience? A lover? The word love appeared once beside her name, underlined, then scribbled out. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was the truth about what he'd done, but the human part of me couldn't help wondering who this woman was and what she knew about my father that I didn't. That night, I pulled out an old photo album from the closet and flipped through page after page of birthdays, Christmas mornings, family barbecues. In one photo, my father stood next to a woman I didn't recognize, tall, auburn hair, a calm smile. My mother stood on the other side of the frame, her expression distant, her hand resting loosely on his arm. On the back of the photo, in neat handwriting, Dan and Eleanor, 2003. I traced the name with my thumb, heart pounding. 2003. That was the year my parents almost divorced. Mom had told me it was because of stress, her word for things too painful to explain. Now I wasn't sure what kind of stress she'd meant. The next morning, I drove to the local library. It felt ridiculous, but I needed answers. If Eleanor was real, maybe she'd left traces, an obituary, an address, a public record. It didn't take long. There she was, Eleanor Grant, retired teacher, formerly of Chestnut Hill, passed away in 2019, 2 years before Dad. Her obituary mentioned no husband, no children, just her love for literature and her lifelong friendship with the Hayes family. The words hit like a hammer, lifelong friendship. I drove straight to Chestnut Hill, to the address listed. A modest white house with peeling shutters and a garden that had gone wild without her care. Through the windows, I could see the dust-covered furniture, the lingering emptiness of a life left behind. The mailbox still had her name. For a moment, I felt absurd, standing there like an intruder, a stranger chasing ghosts. But when I turned to leave, I saw it. A small box left on the porch, the edges warped from rain, a faded note taped to the top that read, "For Emily Hayes, if she ever comes." My blood went cold. Someone had known I would come. Inside was a smaller notebook, not my father's, but Eleanor's. The handwriting was rounder, softer, but the first line stopped me where I stood. Daniel never forgave himself, but he was never cruel. The entries that followed weren't love letters, not exactly. They were conversations. She wrote to him the way one might write to a patient, or a student, or someone they were trying to save. She spoke of honesty, guilt, redemption. Of the day he told her he'd forged the will. He said he couldn't bear the thought of losing the house his daughter grew up in. I told him love shouldn't be built on lies. He said he'd fix it someday. My throat tightened. He hadn't fixed it. He'd buried it, along with himself. I sat on Eleanor's porch for hours, reading through her words until the sun dipped below the trees. The final entry was dated just weeks before she died. If Emily ever finds this, tell her father loved her too much to let her see who he was. But love doesn't have to be pure to be real. I clutched the notebook to my chest, shaking. Everything I'd believed about my father, the man, the myth, the hero, had splintered. But so had my anger. Because now I understood something I hadn't before. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who couldn't live with his mistakes, who spent the rest of his life trying to atone in silence. When I returned home, the night felt quieter than it should have been. I placed both notebooks, his and Eleanor's, side by side on the kitchen table. They looked like mirrors of each other, one filled with guilt, the other with forgiveness. I brewed a cup of tea and sat there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock, the echo of his voice in my memory saying, "You'll understand one day." I thought about what it meant to understand someone, truly understand them, and whether love could survive that kind of knowledge. Maybe it could. Maybe that was what Eleanor had meant. The next morning, I called Uncle Michael. His voice was wary, brittle. I told him I had something to show him. An hour later, he was at my table, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of Eleanor's notebook. He read in silence, then leaned back, his eyes glassy. He was trying to make it right, I said softly. Michael nodded slowly. He should have told me. He couldn't, I said. Maybe he thought it was too late. He looked at me, then at the two notebooks. What are you going to do with them? I don't know, I said truthfully. But maybe the truth doesn't have to destroy what's left of this family. He exhaled, long and heavy, and for the first time in years, he reached for my hand. You sound like him, he said. I smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. The morning light spilled across the table, catching the edge of my father's handwriting, his final entry, the one I hadn't noticed before. Eleanor said truth hurts less when it's shared. If she's right, then I hope Emily reads this and sees me as I was, not as I pretended to be. And for the first time since he died, I did. In the weeks that followed, I found myself visiting my father's grave more often, not out of grief, but out of conversation. I would sit on the cold stone bench beside his name and talk about the weather, about my mother's distant sighs when she passed his old armchair, about how the house felt too large and too silent. And sometimes, when the wind shifted, it felt as if he was listening. But there was something else building inside me, a pull, a quiet insistence that this story wasn't over. The truth about the will, about Eleanor, about his guilt, it didn't feel finished. It felt paused. One afternoon, I went to see my mother. She was in the garden, pruning the roses, her hands steady and precise, as if trimming away the past one thorn at a time. You found his things, she said before I even spoke. I nodded. The notebooks. And, she asked, her tone unreadable. You already knew about Eleanor, didn't you? For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she looked up, meeting my eyes with a calm that felt like surrender. I knew her. She was his friend. His conscience, maybe. I hated her for that. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Because you needed to believe in him, she said simply. And maybe I did too. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I realized then how heavy her silence had been all these years, not protective, but punishing. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. He changed the will, I said quietly, to keep the house for me. I know, she whispered. I found out after he died. I wanted to fix it, but it felt cruel to erase his final act, even if it was wrong. It wasn't just guilt, Mom. He thought he was saving something. Yes, she said, with a small, weary smile. But sometimes saving someone means letting go, not holding tighter. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words kept circling in my mind, echoing through the hallways of the house like a quiet truth that had been waiting years to be spoken. I went downstairs and opened the notebooks again. My father's handwriting seemed different now, not the language of a liar or a coward, but of a man trying to translate his shame into something his daughter could one day forgive. And I did. Not easily. Not completely. But enough. The next morning, I packed both notebooks and drove to the courthouse. The clerk looked puzzled when I handed over the documents and explained what my father had done. You're not required to, she began, but I interrupted gently. I know, but I needed to be right. When I walked out, the air felt lighter. The sky, once dull and gray, opened into pale blue. The truth didn't erase him. It made him human again. That evening, I found myself drawn back to Eleanor's house. It was quiet, untouched, but it no longer felt like a place of secrets. I sat on the porch steps and watched the sunset spill gold across the overgrown garden. For the first time, I thought of her not as the woman who stood between my parents, but as someone who had saved a part of my father I never knew, the part that could still hope. I took out my journal, not his, not hers, but mine, and began to write. Not to record the past, but to release it. Dad, I wrote, I understand now. You weren't perfect. You weren't who I thought you were. But maybe love doesn't need perfection. Maybe love is what survives after the truth burns everything else away. The words didn't make it easier, but they made it real. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The house slowly filled with life again. New laughter, new sounds, new air. My mother began baking like she used to. My uncle started visiting more. And I started teaching my own daughter, the one he never met, how to plant roses, how to forgive, how to remember. One afternoon, she found the 2 notebooks on the shelf and asked what they were. I smiled, brushing the dust off their covers. Stories, I said, about people who made mistakes and tried to fix them. Did they? She asked. I thought about it, then nodded. In their own way. She smiled and went back to playing, and I realized something simple, something Eleanor and my father had both understood. The truth, once uncovered, doesn't destroy love. It deepens it, gives it shape, texture, weight. It turns memory into understanding. Years later, when the roses bloomed again, I buried both notebooks beneath the garden soil, where the roots would take them. I didn't mark the spot. I didn't need to. I knew what they contained would live on, not in paper, not in guilt, but in what we became afterward. And when the wind rustled through the branches, I could almost hear him say, "You finally understood." Months passed, and though the house was quieter, it no longer felt haunted. It felt like a place that had finally exhaled. My mother spent her mornings in the garden again, pruning the roses with care, while I found peace in the small rituals of ordinary life. Brewing coffee, reading by the window, writing in the journal I had started the night I buried my father's notebooks. But something inside me had changed permanently. Once you learn the truth, once you see the cracks in someone you loved, you can't go back to blindness. You just learn to see differently. One afternoon, I got a letter from a law firm in Ohio. Inside was a small envelope sealed in my father's handwriting. The lawyer explained that it had been found among documents he'd never filed, in a safe deposit box. My hands trembled as I opened it. For Emily, it began, the familiar slant of his script soft and uneven. If you're reading this, then you found what I couldn't say while I was here. I didn't want you to remember me as a man who ran from the truth, but as someone who finally faced it, even if too late. The house, the money, the choices, they were never what mattered. It was you. You were the only thing I ever did right. Whatever you think of me, I hope you live honestly. Don't bury what hurts. Grow around it. That's how forgiveness starts. Love, Dad. I read it 3 times, unable to stop the tears. It wasn't redemption, not really. Just a confession wrapped in love, fragile and flawed. But it was enough. That evening, I took my daughter for a walk by the lake, the same lake where I had found his first notebook. The air smelled like rain and pine, and the surface shimmered with the dying light of sunset. "Mom," she said suddenly, "do you think Grandpa would like it here?" I smiled through the ache in my chest. "I think he would," I said. "He'd probably sit right there by the water and say it looks the same, even though it doesn't." She laughed, and we stood there quietly, listening to the soft lapping of the waves. I thought of the man I once believed him to be, and the one I had come to know through his words. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who tried. And maybe that's all any of us can do. When we got home, I placed his letter in my journal. The pages of my own writing were filling quickly now, thoughts about him, about my mother, about the legacy of silence we'd finally broken. But this story wasn't about regret anymore. It was about continuation, about how truth, once spoken, becomes a bridge instead of a wound. Years later, when I sold the house, I didn't tell anyone about the notebooks buried beneath the roses. I left them there, letting the garden keep it secret. The new owners were a young couple expecting their first child. As I handed over the keys, the woman said, "It feels like a place with history." I smiled. "It is," I said, "but it's a good one." On my last night there, I walked through each room, touching the banister my father had built, the old oak table where we used to eat Sunday dinners, the worn-out rug by the fireplace where my daughter had taken her first steps. It wasn't sadness I felt anymore. It was gratitude. Every memory, every mistake, every truth, it had led here to peace. When I stepped outside for the last time, I looked back at the house glowing in the soft evening light and whispered, "We're okay now." And I meant it. In the end, the journals hadn't destroyed anything. They'd simply told the story as it was, raw, imperfect, human. The story of a man who hid too much, a woman who stayed silent too long, and a daughter who decided to listen when it finally mattered. Maybe that's what truth does. It doesn't free us from the past. It just teaches us how to live with it. And as I drove away, the sunset fading behind the trees, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sorrow, not relief, just understanding. 2 years later, the lake house was nothing but a memory, though sometimes, when the world went still, I could still hear the creak of its porch or the wind whispering through its shutters. Life had found its rhythm again, a quieter, steadier beat. My daughter, Lily, was in middle school now, her laughter a constant reminder that not everything about the past had to hurt. We'd moved to a small town in Vermont, where the hills seemed to rise out of the mist every morning like a promise. The town was full of strangers who didn't know my history, and maybe that was what I needed, to be someone whose life didn't begin with loss. Yet, even here, my father's words followed me. I kept his letter in my bedside drawer, folded and refolded so many times the creases had become permanent. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd take it out and trace the ink with my finger, wondering what it meant to grow around pain. I thought I understood, but the truth was, I was still learning. One gray morning in late autumn, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, older than any of the ones I'd found before. The first page read, "If she ever forgives me, tell her this is for her." I froze, my pulse stuttering. The handwriting wasn't my father's, it was my mother's. My breath caught as I turned the next page, and the scent of old paper and faint perfume rose from the pages, so familiar it almost hurt. To Emily, the first entry began. "I know what you found. I know what he left behind. But before you decide what kind of man your father was, I need you to know what kind of woman I became because of him." My mother's journal wasn't long, but every word was a revelation. She wrote about the resentment she had buried, the arguments we never saw, the fear of losing everything if she let herself admit the truth. She had stayed for me, she said, not because she forgave him, but because she didn't want me to inherit her bitterness. He wasn't cruel, she wrote. He was lost. And maybe that's worse, because you can't hate someone who's drowning if you're the one holding the rope. I stopped reading after that line. I sat there for hours, the journal open on my lap, trying to process what it meant that both of them, in their own broken ways, had been trying to protect me. But from what? From truth? From love? From themselves? I read the rest that night. Her final entry was written 2 weeks before she passed. "If Emily ever reads this, tell her I tried. I didn't always know how to be soft. I thought strength meant silence. But maybe love is what survives after both of us have stopped pretending." I didn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too full of ghosts that weren't supposed to follow me here. When morning came, I took both journals, my father's and my mother's, and drove to the edge of town, where the forest met a narrow stream. The air smelled like pine and frost, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I sat on a rock, holding one book in each hand, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel torn between them. I just felt whole. They had both been wrong, and they had both been right. In their love, in their fear, in the way they had tried to make peace through words instead of actions. And somehow, their failures had taught me what they never could while they were alive. I opened my own journal, the one I'd been writing since the night I found his first notebook, and wrote. "They gave me silence, but I will answer with voice." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't profound, but it was mine. A few months later, a local bookstore owner asked me if I'd ever consider publishing my reflections. I hesitated at first, but eventually, I said yes. The book wasn't about my parents directly, at least, not on the surface. It was about the weight of inherited silence, about how families hide truths in plain sight, about the strange kind of love that survives even through resentment. When it was published, the response was quiet but meaningful. Letters came in from strangers, people who said they saw their own families in my words, their own unspoken wounds. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me permission to forgive someone who's been gone for 10 years. I cried when I read that. Forgiveness had once felt like surrender to me, like letting the past win. But now, I saw it differently. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was about understanding the human mess behind every decision, the fear, the pride, the love that tried and failed but still mattered. Years passed. Lily grew older, her eyes and smile more like mine every day. Sometimes she asked about her grandparents, and I told her stories that were honest but kind. How her grandfather loved building things, how her grandmother could never keep a secret but always kept her promises. I didn't hide the truth, but I didn't let it define them either. One spring morning, when Lily was 13, she found my old journal on the shelf. "Can I read this someday?" she asked. I looked at her, my heart catching for a moment. "Someday," I said, "when you're ready to see that grown-ups aren't always heroes." She smiled, not understanding yet, and went back to her homework. That night, I added one last page to my journal. "If she ever reads this," I wrote, echoing my mother's voice, "I hope she knows that love isn't always clear and truth isn't always gentle. But both are worth finding, no matter the cost." Then I closed it, placed it beside the others, and blew out the candle. The house fell silent, but not the kind of silence I used to fear. This one was warm, steady, and alive, the kind that waits, patiently, for the next voice to be heard. 10 years later, I returned to the lake house, not as a daughter seeking answers, but as a woman who had finally made peace with what she'd found. The place had been sold years ago, but the new owners allowed me to visit after I explained who I was. The air was thick with summer humidity, cicadas humming in the distance. The dock was still there, though weathered, its boards warped and silvered by time. I walked across it slowly, the water glinting below, and sat at the edge, my reflection rippling beside the clouds. In my bag were 3 journals, his, hers, and mine, each one worn, each one ending with the same question written in a different hand. What does forgiveness look like? I had no single answer, but maybe that was the point. Forgiveness wasn't an event. It was a language we never stopped learning. I pulled out my father's journal first. The leather had cracked, but his handwriting still looked alive, restless and uneven. He had written his pain like a confession, turning every regret into a map back to himself. Then my mother's, where her words were steadier, sharper. She had written like she was trying to hold her world together with sentences. I placed both beside me and opened mine. The wind lifted the pages, and for a second it looked like they were all breathing together, 3 stories tangled into one long inhale. I began to read out loud, softly, to the water, about him, about her, about me, about the things we inherit without realizing: silence, pride, the desperate need to be understood. And as I read, I realized that I didn't feel alone anymore. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes, reminders that even flawed love leaves behind light. A voice behind me broke the stillness. "Mom." I turned. Lily stood a few feet away, taller now, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. She had that same look I used to give my father, curious, uncertain, full of questions she didn't know how to ask. "I wanted to see it," she said quietly. "The place you always wrote about." I nodded, patting the space beside me. "Come sit." She joined me, her sneakers brushing against the dock. "These are theirs?" she asked, pointing at the journals. "Yes," I said. "And this one's mine." "Will I ever get to read them?" she asked after a pause. I smiled. "Maybe someday, but I want you to write your own first." She laughed softly, thinking I was joking. But I wasn't, because I'd learned that stories only matter when they become bridges, not walls. We sat there until the sun dipped below the trees, turning the lake into a mirror of gold. When the first stars appeared, I gathered the journals, tied them together with a faded ribbon, and placed them gently in the wooden box I'd brought. I didn't bury it. I left it on the porch, under the beam of the old light that still flickered from time to time. It wasn't about hiding or keeping secrets anymore. It was about leaving them somewhere they belonged, between earth and water, memory and peace. As we walked back to the car, Lily asked, "Do you think they'd be proud of you?" I thought about it for a long time. "I think," I said, "they'd finally understand me." The drive home was quiet, but not heavy. The road wound through the forest, and the headlights painted brief silver shapes across the trees. I could feel the weight that had carried through generations lifting, piece by piece, replaced by something steadier. Not joy, exactly, but acceptance. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, I opened a fresh notebook and began to write again. But this time, it wasn't about loss. It was about continuation, about how even broken stories can become beginnings. I used to think forgiveness was something you give to the past, I wrote. But maybe it's something you offer to the future instead. The words came easier now. My father's restless hand, my mother's sharp script. I could almost feel them guiding me, not haunting me. Maybe that was their final gift, the permission to move on without forgetting. Before turning off the light, I glanced at the bookshelf, where their journals rested side by side. They looked peaceful there, as if they had been waiting all along for the ending I finally gave them. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle, the kind that doesn't ache anymore, but hums softly, like the last note of a song you finally know by heart.